We turn to Resolution 16, automatic voter registration, and that will be proposed by Alec Kerr and seconded by Daniel. And Alec's a first-time speaker at conference.
Thanks. Ticking first-time speaker conference works every time.
So does the switching off button, by the way.
Right. As a party, we are one of the most progressive forces in the EU when it comes to putting our beliefs around democratic participation into practice. We are a party of Democrats, and our actions in government show that. The SNP has done its utmost to ensure that everyone who lives or works in Scotland gets a say in how their country is run. Whether that's through extending the right to vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, ensuring that EU nationals who have chosen to make Scotland their home have the vote, or whether that's providing the entire country with a say on their future through a referendum. That conference is progress. In spite of all that we as a party have achieved, however, we must always be looking forward, and that is why I've drafted this resolution with the help of Daniel. The resolution mandates the Scottish Government to look at other ways of organising elections that are used in other countries to boost turnout. In particular, it mentions holding elections on weekends and automatic voter registration. Now, holding elections on weekends is pretty self-explanatory, conference, so I won't patronise you there. And instead, I'll focus on automatic voter registration and why I believe we need it. At its most basic, automatic voter registration means that all citizens would be automatically added to the electoral register if they were eligible to vote. In practice, this would likely mean that an individual would have their address on the register updated according to already existing data gathered from interactions with government or public bodies. So that could be school, paying tax, applying for benefits, use of the NHS, or claiming a pension. For the creation of this central list, it would require close working between governments and public bodies. I mean, some of that data is held by the Westminster government. And while initially it may be challenging for a system like that to be pulled together, it would provide noticeable benefits for existing services and people who use them. For instance, people changing address on one public body might automatically change it in others. Now, as for why we should be looking for ways to boost democratic participation, conference, unfortunately, across much of the world, there is a downward trend in democratic participation and in the belief in the system of democracy itself. In the UK, we've seen turnout fall from 80% to 70% before 2000, and to 60% with the 2017 election only reaching a turnout of 68.7%. In fact, here in Scotland, the turnout in 2017 was 66.4%, which was down from 71.1%. I would argue, friends, that this low turnout certainly did not help our vote. There's been studies which suggest that many now believe that living in democracy is not essential. So it's against this backdrop that we should be striving to remove as many barriers from the process of voting to ensure that everyone feels they have a stake in the success of our country and our democracy. Automatic voter registration is already used in countries across the world. To pick just a few in Europe: Italy, Switzerland, France, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. Now, I know how much we all love the Scandinavian countries here in the SNP, so I'll take Sweden as an example. The lowest turnout they have had in recent times is 80.1% in 2002. It's 80.1%, conference. They've averaged 85% turnout since 1944. So now, I'm not suggesting that automatic voter registration or indeed weekend voting would lead to turnouts anything like this by themselves. But I do believe that it is a good first step towards emulating more of the practices of our Scandinavian neighbours. There is a very strong institutional push there to ensure that records are up to date, and culturally there is a much greater emphasis placed on taking part in democracy within and out with the electoral cycle. The one thing I know we can all agree on, conference, which is also mentioned in the resolution, is that we should not be throwing extra barriers in the way of voting. The Tories' plan to introduce mandatory voter ID in polling stations would be such a regressive step. Mandatory voter IDs have already been implemented in many Republican states in America, and has made it more difficult for those from poorer backgrounds and ethnic minorities who might not have ID to take part in voting. It would be an outrageous step. Our amazing team at Westminster has already in fact taken forward automatic voter registration, with Owen Thompson bringing it forward for a Westminster Hall debate in 2016, and through his work as the convener of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Democratic Participation. I had to look through that when I was researching this, and I found it very helpful. I think it's important that as a party, we carry this work on. So I'd urge you to support this resolution, conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Daniel to second the resolution, to be followed by David Buckley, who will speak in favour of the resolution. Doug.
I'm going to concentrate on another aspect of the resolution, voter ID, automatic. Sorry, I'll just read it. Conference, next May, voters in parts of England will have to show ID in order to vote in local elections as part of a Tory pledge to stamp out electoral fraud. Or at least that's their story. I hear my doots. Whatever system gets implemented, it's not going to be free. Whether it's barcode scanners in every polling station or more staff to deal with the added burden of checking photo ID, elections will become much dearer. So if that's fine by the party whose raison d'etre is lower public spending, fraud must be pretty rife, eh? But it's not. Their own figures show that of the 51.4 million votes cast in all elections in 2015, there were only 130 allegations of fraud. That's 0.00025% of votes, or 1 in every 400,000. To put that in perspective, if repeated in June this year, that would have led to a grand total of 7 fraudulently cast votes across the whole of Scotland, which isn't even enough to swing 1 seat, unless they all happen to be cast in North East Fife. The reality of electoral fraud is that most cases are isolated and can be tackled locally, which is why the Electoral Reform Society describes voter ID as a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Quite simply, voter fraud is not a significant problem in the UK, so why are the Tories so hell-bent on introducing voter ID? It's widely agreed that such laws make it harder for folk in lower incomes to vote. When it was trialled in Northern Ireland, it was found that poorer folk were less likely to have the necessary documents, so free voter ID cards were introduced, but they've not got any plans to do this, which is surprising considering their track record on civil liberties. Voter ID laws are enforced in 31 US states, and studies show that this has had a disproportionate effect on the poor, the young, and ethnic minorities. It is, of course, a complete coincidence that these are the demographics that are most likely not to vote Tory. At the very moment when we should be trying to increase voter turnouts, the Tories want to implement measures that are proven to do the exact opposite, and I think we all know why. They are the party that introduced individual voter registration, leading to hundreds of thousands of voters falling off the electoral roll, most of whom just happened to be non-Tory voters. The party that wants to change constituency boundaries in a way that just happens to make it easier for them to win a majority. And the party that denied EU citizens a vote on their own futures in the EU referendum, which just happened to swing the result to leave. Conference, I urge you to back this motion, not just to look at ways of increasing turnouts, but to say loud and clear that this party is sick fed up of the Tory party's cynical attempts to gerrymander its way to election victories. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, to speak in favour of the resolution, David Buckley.
Hello, Conference. Yeah, Doug's pretty much said exactly what I was about to say, so I'll keep this very brief. Good afternoon, delegates. I wasn't intending to speak on this resolution until about half an hour ago, but I do feel that as students' convener, I can give a sort of certain perspective on it. It's a simple, unfortunate truth, as Doug has pointed out, that the younger generation do not vote in as larger numbers as older demographics. And while this may be partly due to a lower sense of engagement, I do feel that accessibility is also a factor. Speaking personally, I moved flat just a couple of months ago, and regardless of the fact that I'm still, I consider myself to be more politically engaged than my peers, I still haven't updated my electoral register. This is something that is common across the entire student community. Students are generally transient people. And so I feel that there are a lot of people who are slipping through the cracks, and this resolution, this policy, would help improve student engagement and improve the number of students who are actually on the register. As Doug has already said, the Tories wish to introduce mandatory ID checks at polling stations. I feel that this would be utterly abhorrent and undemocratic. The party of government should never be afraid of the people. They should never be wishing to put boundaries in the way of the voters. And I think that we should absolutely endorse this resolution and set another boundary between ourselves and the Tories on how to run a democratic country. Thank you, Conference.
Thank you, David. There are no cards in against. Alec, would you like to sum up or waive your right to sum up once you're finished blathering with your colleagues? There There are no cards in against, conference, so can I ask, is the resolution passed by acclaim?